the oppressive heat of the summer of 1716. 14 of South Carolina's most powerful plantation owners assembled at the Greyfield Estate for what they assumed would be another routine meeting to discuss business. None of them would ever leave that house alive. 3 days later, when officials finally arrived, the scene they uncovered was beyond comprehension. The charred remains of all 14 men were found arranged in a perfect circle around a massive coal furnace. Their wrists were locked in heavy iron shackles, their mouths stuffed with raw cotton. The only living soul in the house was a single slave woman, Espiranza de Lima, seated calmly at the kitchen table. She was quietly humming a Portuguese lullaby, a large kitchen knife in one hand, a wet in the other, slowly dragging the blade across its surface in deliberate, steady strokes. When questioned, she spoke just one sentence in broken English. Justice burns slower than coal, but it burns complete. The colonial government moved quickly to erase what had happened. By direct order of Governor Robert Johnson, every record of that night was sealed away in Charleston's archives, locked from public eyes for over 200 years. But tonight, we open that vault. This is the real story of the Greyfield Massacre, a tale of vengeance, so precise, so deliberate, that it reshaped how an entire colony viewed its human property. Before we go any further into the life of Esperanza de Lima and the night she changed colonial South Carolina forever, I need you to do something. Hit that subscribe button, ring the notification bell, and tell me in the comments where you're listening from. Stories like this, buried by time, hidden by those in power, deserve to be told, and you never know. There may be dark chapters like this hiding in your own state's past. But to truly understand what happened on that sweltering August night, we have to go back 15 years earlier to the port city of Charleston, South Carolina. The year was 1701. The colony was thriving. Rice was king, and the wealth it brought to white landowners was built on the backs of enslaved Africans, who worked the sprawling plantations along the lowland rivers. Among the richest and most feared of these planters was Edmund Greyfield, a second-generation colonist, whose family had transformed 3,000 acres of swamp north of the Ashley River into a booming rice empire, even in an era defined by cruelty. Edmund Greyfield stood apart. He was a tall man, towering over 6 feet, with piercing pale blue eyes that never seemed to look at people, only through them. His name was whispered in the slave quarters up and down the coast. The stories said that if you were sent to Greyfield Estate, you either died within a year, or survived as nothing more than an empty shell of who you once were. In September of that year, a Portuguese slave ship, the Santa Maria, sailed into Charleston Harbor with 180 captured Africans from the coast of Angola. Among them was a young woman in her early 20s who would be sold under the name Esperanza de Lima. To the slave traders, she was unremarkable, average height, average build, but with deep, intelligent eyes and intricate tribal scar patterns carved into her shoulders. To those who could read the markings, they told a story. She was the daughter of a powerful chief. A leader's blood ran through her veins. She had been trained since childhood in the arts of strategy, diplomacy, and the ancient herbal knowledge her people considered sacred. To the Europeans, such things were dismissed as witchcraft. To her, it was survival. She had seen her village burned to the ground by Portuguese raiders. She had watched her father, the chief, cut down before her eyes, her people enslaved, her home destroyed, and in her mind, every white face she saw from that moment on was tied to that crime. Edmund Greyfield bought her for £42 sterling, a high price that reflected her youth, health, and strength. His reason for choosing her was simple. His previous house servant, an older woman named Sarah, had recently been beaten to death for spilling wine on his prized imported carpet. He needed a replacement. From her first day at Greyfield Estate, Esperanza began a campaign of patient observation. She learned the layout of the house, memorized the comings and goings of servants and overseers, and quietly listened to conversations not meant for her ears. Though she picked up English quickly, she pretended to know less than she did. She made herself invisible. The Greyfield Estate wasn't just a plantation. It was the unofficial headquarters of a secretive group known as the Rice Council. 14 of the wealthiest and most influential planters in the colony met there each month. They decided rice prices, wrote the rules for slave ownership, and ensured that London's influence stayed as far away from their affairs as possible. These men were Edmund Greyfield himself, William Pettant, the colony's largest rice producer, James Rutherford, colonial judge, Marcus Sutton, head of the biggest slave trading operation between Charleston and Savannah, Henry Caldwell, politically tied to the governor, Thomas Heron, British naval officer, Benjamin Fairfax, old money and old power, Samuel Kingsley, expert in seasoning newly arrived slaves, Robert Fielding, renowned for his cruelty, Charles Warwick, a hub for plantation intelligence, Jonathan Critton, record keeper for slave breeding programs, David Norris, plantation doctor, Alexander Hartwell, keeper of runaway slaves, and George Baxter, the youngest, known for his zeal and violence. To them, people were not people, they were tools. Tools to be managed, traded, worn down, and replaced. And month after month, Esperanza served them at their meetings, silently refilling wine cups and clearing dishes, while their conversations spilled out in cold, matter-of-fact tones. She heard them joke about tearing families apart, boast about breaking disobedient slaves, and plan expansions that would require hundreds more human bodies. But for all the cruelty she heard, it wasn't until the spring of 1715 that her plan for revenge truly took shape, because that was when she met Wayne. The plantation ledger listed him simply as Boy Tom, but his real name was Wayne, born in 1693 on the Rutherford plantation. He was strong, intelligent, and miraculously still defiant in spirit. He could read, having been secretly taught by an overseer long since gone, and had been quietly passing that knowledge to other slaves whenever he could. Esperanza and Wayne began to share information, first about their owners' schedules, then about escape routes, and eventually, their bond deepened into love. They communicated through coded songs and gestures, invisible to white eyes, each note and movement carrying plans, warnings, or hope. They both knew the risk. Discovery meant torture and death, but what they also knew was that they were no longer planning to just survive. They were planning for something far greater. By the final months of 1715, Esperanza and Wayne had built what was, without question, one of the most sophisticated underground intelligence networks in all of colonial South Carolina. She used her role inside Greyfield Estate to quietly gather valuable information: patrol schedules, changes in colonial slave laws, vulnerabilities in the defenses of other plantations. Wayne, meanwhile, had mobility on his side, frequently loaned out for heavy labor on neighboring estates. He used those opportunities to make contacts across the region. They weren't planning a simple escape for themselves. This was something far bolder: an organized uprising that could potentially free hundreds of enslaved people in a single strike. Safe houses had been identified. Sympathetic whites had been quietly sounded out. Even messages had been smuggled. 2 free black settlements in Spanish Florida communities that could offer sanctuary to those who broke free. But their careful, calculated work unraveled in an instant, because of one conversation Esperanza wasn't meant to hear. On March 15, 1716, during the monthly Rice Council meeting, Edmund Greyfield announced plans to expand his breeding program. He explained to the other men how certain women from his estate would be paired with select males from other plantations to produce what he called superior working stock. The chosen women would be relocated to a separate compound, constantly monitored to ensure pregnancies were carried. To term Esperanza's name topped the list. She didn't flinch, didn't allow the smallest change to cross her face as she poured wine for the councilmen. But inside, something shifted, something irreversible. For 15 years she had endured in silence, fueled by hope, Hope for freedom, hope for revenge, hope for a future where she might live as a person instead of property. Now Greyfield's plan was to strip away even that, reducing her to a breeding animal. That night, she met Wayne at their usual place, a fallen cypress, deep in the rice fields, where the drone of insects and the calls of nightbirds swallowed their voices. She told him what she'd heard, and together they understood the grim truth. Once she was moved to the breeding compound, their link would be severed, their network would dissolve, their uprising would be over before it began. Wayne's solution was immediate. Run. Leave that very night. He had already made contact with a Spanish trader willing to smuggle them to St. Augustine within a week. There, they could live free together and, perhaps, work to help others from a distance. But Esperanza shook her head. Running saves us, she said softly in their native Portuguese, a language they reserved only for their most private words. But it changes nothing for our people. These men will keep doing what they do. More ships will come. More families will be broken. More children will be born into chains. For years she had listened to these 14 men speak with casual cruelty about human lives, her people's lives, as if they were tools. She knew their habits, their weaknesses. She knew when they were most vulnerable, and she believed they had one chance, a single, devastating strike that would be remembered long after they were gone. One chance to make these men feel the kind of fear they had inflicted for decades. Wayne understood exactly what she was suggesting, and the danger was staggering. Death didn't frighten him. Slaves lived with death every day, but the torture they would face if caught was another matter. He had seen it. Punishments designed to crush not just the body but the spirit, to make examples of anyone who dared to resist. Yet she was right. An escape would save only them. Her plan, as dangerous as it was, could echo far beyond Greyfield's walls. For 2 weeks they worked in secret, refining every detail. It would be equal parts intelligence operation, psychological strike, and tactical assault. Esperanza would create the opening at the next Rice Council meeting. Wayne would secure materials, set up false alibis for certain sympathetic slaves, and prepare backup plans for every possible scenario. It all relied on one simple truth, as had learned over 15 years of quiet observation. The Rice Council believed themselves untouchable, so untouchable in fact, that they never considered their own personal safety. The date was set. June 23, 1716. The morning arrived under a heavy, suffocating heat, the kind of summer day that clung to the skin and drained the breath from the lungs. Espiranza rose before dawn, as she had for 15 years, and began her tasks. But today, every step, every movement, was loaded with purpose. The meeting would start at 2 p.m., giving the planters time to arrive and conduct private dealings before the formal agenda. These gatherings often stretched well into the evening, 4, sometimes 6 hours depending on how much imported rum Greyfield served. Esperanza had studied their routines like clockwork. She knew Marcus Sutton would always arrive early for one-on-one business with Greyfield. She knew Benjamin Fairfax's weak bladder would pull him away from the table every 90 minutes. She knew the discussion of rice prices came before dinner, and that the most depraved talk about slave management began only after the rum had loosened their tongues, and she knew about the coal furnace. Greyfield Estate's kitchen was built to feed not just the household, but overseers, craftsmen, and domestic staff. The crown jewel of that kitchen was a coal-burning furnace imported from Britain, 8 feet tall, 4 feet wide, made of fire brick and iron. It could burn hot enough to melt metal, and Greyfield loved to boast about it to his guests. What he didn't know was that Esperanza had been studying it for months, how to push it to maximum heat, how to maintain that heat for hours, and how to control airflow for very specific results. Bit by bit, she had built up an enormous stockpile of coal in a nearby storage room, telling anyone who asked that it was for an upcoming expansion of cooking operations. Then, 3 days before the meeting, the news came that ended any hesitation she might have had. Wayne had been sold. James Rutherford had decided he needed more field hands for an expansion, and persuaded Greyfield to sell him, Boy Tom, for £60. The transfer would happen the morning after the Rice Council meeting, with that Esperanza knew her window was closing. In 3 days, she would lose the man she loved, be forced into the breeding program, and watch the council continue their reign of terror. The time for patience was over. That night, she met Wayne beneath the fallen cypress for the last time. They whispered to each other in the dark, trying to fit 15 years of love, struggle, and hope into a few precious hours. He begged her one last time to forget the plan, to leave with him that very night. There was still time to reach Spanish Florida. Still time to disappear. Still time to build a life together. Far from the cruelty of plantation life. But Esperanza's mind was fixed like iron. These men think they are gods, she told him, her voice low but unshakable. They think they can do anything to us without consequence. Tomorrow, I will show them they are wrong. I will show them we are human, and humans fight back when pushed past the breaking point. Wayne knew that tone. In the 2 years he'd known her, he had learned to hear the steel in her voice, the tone that meant no argument could reach her. So he didn't waste their last moments trying to change her mind. Instead, they spent those precious hours sharpening the final details of her plan. The next morning, June 22nd, Esperanza began her last preparations. She moved through the kitchen like any other day, but her eyes, her mind, were scanning, cataloging, calculating. She inventoried every tool, every ingredient, every scrap of material. She paid special attention to the iron shackles and chains, stored in the pantry normally used to restrain slaves during punishment making. Mental notes of their placement. She studied the flow of the kitchen, when other domestic slaves passed through, where they lingered, how to ensure they would be nowhere near the dining room or kitchen when her moment came. This had to look like a normal day, until the very instant it didn't. And then there was the furnace at dawn. She began quietly feeding coal into its mouth, slow and deliberate, each addition stoking the fire higher without drawing attention. By late morning, the furnace was searing hot at the very edge of its limits, ready to hold that infernal heat for hours. To anyone watching, she was simply preparing for the monthly Rice Council meeting. She set the polished crystal glasses on the table, arranged the dining room with meticulous care, and moved silently from room to room, her face a mask of calm. But behind that mask, every move brought her closer to unleashing the storm she had been planning for 15 years. By noon, on June 23rd, the first of the Rice Council arrived. Marcus Sutton came early, as always, riding up the oak-lined avenue, with the slow, deliberate confidence of a man who owned over 800 human beings and believed no one on earth could touch him. Esperanza watched from the kitchen window as he swung down from his horse and handed the reins to a stable slave. At 53, Sutton carried the bulk of decades of indulgence, thinning gray hair, a ruddy face fed by imported rum, and a belly softened by luxury. But his eyes were sharp, cold, the eyes of a man who had made a fortune seasoning newly arrived Africans, breaking their bodies, their spirits, until they accepted their bondage as unchangeable. The most defiant slaves from across the colony were often sent to Sutton. His reputation for fixing problems was so great that other planters paid him dearly for his methods. Greyfield himself greeted Sutton at the front door with the courtly politeness reserved for Pierce courtesy that stood in sharp contrast to the contempt they showed the enslaved. Together, they vanished into Greyfield's private study to discuss matters too vile even for the other councilmen: new control techniques and ways to pressure the colonial government into easing restrictions on the slave trade. Over the next hour, the rest of the council trickled in. William Patton, shadowed by armed overseers after narrowly crushing a rebellion on his plantation. James Rutherford, riding alone, silver-mounted pistols gleaming in his saddle holsters, a magistrate who could pass sentence without fear of question. Henry Caldwell, arriving in an ostentatious carriage plastered with his family's coat of arms, a rolling declaration of his political reach. One by one, they came, shaking hands, exchanging polite talk about the weather, the rice harvest, and the so-called Indian problem on the frontier. They spoke like pioneers, founders of a grand civilization. But Esperanza knew the truth. Their world was built entirely on brutality. Their wealth came from thousands of unpaid, beaten, broken bodies. Their political power existed solely to defend and expand that brutality. At exactly 2 o'clock, Edmund Greyfield called the meeting to order. The 14 men took their places around the enormous English oak tabbouleh piece, so expensive it could have supported a colonial family for years. Polished to a mirror finish, it reflected the light of dozens of candles set in silver candelabras, bathing the room in an aura of power and privilege. Esperanza began her work, gliding silently between them, pouring wine, placing dishes while they talked business. The business of slavery. The agenda started, as it always did, with rice prices in Charleston and ways to squeeze more profit from the coming harvest. Pat On bragged about record yields thanks to his incentive-based system. Food rewards for those who exceeded quotas, systematic punishment for those who fell short. The trick, he said between mouthfuls of imported beef, is to give them just enough hope to keep going, but never enough comfort to make them complacent. Rutherford nodded. Family separation works best for me. Keep their wives and children far away, and they'll work themselves half to death for the chance to be reunited. Around the table, the men shared their methods as casually as if they were discussing farming tools. Breeding programs were dissected with the same detachment as cattle improvements. Punishment techniques were swapped with the enthusiasm of craftsmen exchanging trade secrets, and Esperanza moved among them, pouring, clearing, refilling, her face unreadable. Her mind locked on the moment that was coming. She moved like a shadow, face carved into the mask of a servant, blank, deferential, forgettable. But inside her mind, every detail was being recorded. Where each man sat, which hand they favored, who was most likely to resist, who would panic first. The formal agenda ended. The tone loosened. Now the stories came out, the kind that revealed not just greed, but the artistry of cruelty. Marcus Sutton leaned back in his chair, smiling as he described a new device shipped from the Caribbean, a narrow iron cage, just big enough for a man, hoisted into the full glare of the sun until the victim roasted alive over days. Samuel Kingsley chuckled as he boasted about his breeding experiment, hand-picking slaves to produce a generation of stronger, larger field hands. But it was George Baxter, the youngest, only 35, who dropped the final spark. Onto a powder keg, 15 years in the making. Gentlemen, he announced, as Espiranza poured the last of the brandy, the Spanish are paying top coin for experienced slaves. Their South American colonies can't get enough. I propose we pool our resources, buy a ship, and start exporting our less productive stock. The room lit up. They debated prices, transport routes, permits. They calculated exactly how many lives they could sell without crippling their own labor force. In their voices, she heard the truth. There were no limits. There had never been any. Inside her chest, something snapped. 9:47 p.m., the imported German clock on Greyfield's wall marked the moment. The business was over. The men lounged in the warmth of brandy and candlelight, their coats unbuttoned, their posture slack, kings of a kingdom no one dared challenge. They were deep in talk about a breeding registry to track slave bloodlines across plantations. It was academic to them, clinical, like improving livestock. No one noticed when Esperanza slipped out. No one saw her lock every exit except the kitchen door. No one realized the furnace. Her furnace had been roaring hotter and hotter all night, fed with a secret rhythm she'd been perfecting for months. Her plan was brutally simple. Chain them, drug them, drag them to the heat. Let the furnace do the rest. The brandy had been her weapon, laced with a powder her grandmother once used to subdue hunting dogs without killing them. Minutes after she returned with the decanter, it began. George Baxter was first, blinking, swaying, his chair scraping as he fought to stay upright. Petton's face turned gray as nausea gripped him. Rutherford's eyes couldn't hold focus. Sutton's hands began to shake. Greyfield tried to speak. "Gentlemen, I believe we may have been," but his words slid into a slur. Then his knees buckled and he hit the expensive Persian carpet face first. Within 20 minutes, the Rice Council, the rulers of South Carolina's slave empire, lay unconscious. She moved fast, the same iron shackles they had used to bind. Thousands of slaves now closed around their own wrists and ankles. She worked each lock with deliberate cruelty, tight enough to hurt, not enough to cripple. There would be no easy escape, and no quick death. As she worked, she spoke to them, in Portuguese, in Spanish, in jagged, broken English. To Rutherford, "You sell my Wayne like he is cattle. Tonight, you are cattle." To Sutton, "You break spirits. Tonight, I break yours." To Greyfield, her voice was ice. "You own me. You think I am animal. Tonight, you will see what an animal does when it has nothing left to lose." Then began the hardest part. One by one, she dragged their bodies from the dining room to the kitchen. Each man was heavier than her, but she'd been carrying burdens all her life. 3 hours of sweat and silence. By 2 a.m., they were all there, arranged in a perfect circle around the furnace. Feet toward the heat, wrists shackled behind them, mouths stuffed with raw cotton to smother their screams. The furnace was at its peak, a monster of brick and iron, radiating an unbearable wave of heat that sucked the air from the room. This would not kill them quickly. It would cook them, as the gray light of dawn slipped in. They began to stir. The powder she'd used was calculated, deep, dreamless unconsciousness for hours, but no lingering fog. They would wake clear-headed, able to understand, able to feel. Greyfield's eyes opened first, confusion, then the realization. The iron, the cotton gag, the faces of his friends, bound just like him, ringed around his furnace, and the heat pressing down on him like the weight of the devil's own breath. Esperanza stood over them, silent, waiting for all 14 to awaken. The furnace in the center of the kitchen was a monster, glowing, roaring, breathing waves of heat that scalded the air. Around it, the 14 most powerful men in South Carolina sat shackled, cotton stuffed in their mouths, drenched in sweat. They had ruled like kings. Now they were livestock. Esp. Euronzie sat in the shadows, in the same spot where she'd worked quietly for 15 years. A carving knife glinted in her hand, its slow, steady rhythm against the whetstone, the only sound besides the furnace's hungry growl. She wanted them awake and watching. When the last man's eyes opened, she stood. Her voice was calm, clear, and fluent. Far better English than they'd ever heard from her. "Good morning, gentlemen. I trust you rested well. We have much to discuss." She walked the circle slowly, studying them with the same cold detachment they had used when appraising slaves at market. "For 15 years, she began, I have served your meetings. I have heard you talk about my people as though we were cattle, bought, sold, bred, beaten, killed, for your profit." She stopped before Marcus Sutton, who twisted desperately against his restraints. "You break spirits. You take men and women who still remember being human, and you teach them to forget." Then to Rutherford, "You tear families apart, parents from children, husbands from wives, and you do it because you know, without family, a person is easier to break." Around the circle she went, naming each man, reciting the cruelties he was most proud of, the atrocities he'd committed as casually as signing his name. With every word, their struggles grew more frantic, their muffled cries sharper. Finally, she stopped before Greyfield himself. "And you, are the worst. You could have chosen differently. You had education, wealth, power. You could have been a man. Instead, you chose to be a monster. She stepped back to the furnace. The heat shimmered in the air between them. Today, you will learn what it is to be powerless, to be less than human, to know that your pain is entertainment for someone else. What followed over the next 6 hours would pass into whispered legend and official silence. Colonial records locked it away for over 2 centuries. It began with words. She circled them again, but now her voice was colder, sharper. She dragged their sins into the open, one memory at a time, her tone clinical, the way they'd spoken, of managing human property. "Mr. Patton," she said, kneeling beside him, "do you remember a woman named Asher, bought in 1714, pregnant when she arrived? You worked her in the fields until the day she gave birth. Then you sold her baby before she could hold it. When she cried for 3 days, you had her whipped for excessive noise." Patton's eyes went wide. He remembered. She moved on. "Mr. Warwick, you enjoy punishments. Last spring, you paid £5 to give 50 lashes to a man who'd tried to run. You took your time so he'd stay conscious. You smiled the whole way through." The heat was suffocating now. The air tasted of coal, dust, and fear. Sweat and tears streaked their fine clothes, their faces flushed, their breathing ragged. Some were already wavering toward collapse. But she wasn't done. From Greyfield's study, she retrieved a leather ledger, the book where he'd turned human lives into columns of currency. She opened it. Her voice was flat, businesslike. April 12, 1715. Sold boy named Caesar, age 14, to Rutherford Plantation for breeding purposes. £45 sterling. Note: mother became unmanageable. Recommend immediate sale or disposal. She turned a page. June 3, 1715. Female named Rebecca, died in childbirth. Child survived. Estimated loss, £20 sterling. Note: improve nutrition program for breeding females to reduce mortality rates. Page after page, transaction after transaction. Every entry a family destroyed, a life ground to dust. She read them aloud for hours, forcing each man to sit in the unbearable heat and listen to his own cruelty, reduced to accountancy. By mid-morning, the kitchen was over 120 degrees. Their skin shone with sweat, their eyes glazed from heat exhaustion. That's when she began the final phase. From the storage room, she took long iron rods, the kind used to stoke the furnace. She slid them into the coals until they glowed, red-hot and alive. She turned to them, the metal hissing faintly in the heat. "You have spent years perfecting ways to hurt without killing. Today, your lessons are returned to you." The first rod came out, bright as molten sun. She stood over Greyfield, close enough for him to feel the heat bite at his skin. "This," she said quietly, "is for every man, woman, and child you have branded like cattle." What happened next was heard far beyond the kitchen walls. Out in the fields, slaves stopped in their tracks, looking toward the main house. The sound was unlike anything they'd heard before, the raw, broken screams of men who had never known fear. Until now, Esperanza worked like a surgeon of vengeance, precise, deliberate, and without haste. Each man received the same treatment. The red-hot iron pressed to flesh in places that would not kill outright, but would keep him present inside the pain. She knew exactly how far she could go without letting them slip away, into merciful unconsciousness, because she had learned from them. Every technique, every cruel trick they had ever boasted about at their meetings, she was now using on them. Between each application, she spoke. Not to comfort, but to dismantle. She told them who would inherit their estates. Wondered aloud whether their sons would grow into the same kind of men, or learn to fear what power does when it falls into the wrong hands. "Your son, William," she murmured to Marcus Sutton as he writhed in the heat. "He is only 16. Perhaps he will choose better than his father. Or perhaps, When he learns what happened here, he will learn fear instead. It was as if the furnace burned away their illusions faster than it burned their bodies. Their entire lives had been built on the belief that they were born to rule, that their will was law. Now, bound and helpless, they were learning what it meant to be property, their bodies controlled, their fate decided by another dot. By mid-afternoon, the kitchen was a hell of its own. The air was thick and stifling, over 130 degrees, the furnace's heat pressing in from all sides. Several men began to falter, slipping toward heatstroke, skin flushed and dry, breathing fast and shallow. But Esperanza wouldn't let them escape. She cooled their foreheads with wet cloths, forced small sips of water into parched mouths. "You will not pass out," she told them. "You will not escape into mercy, not yet." The hours stretched on. The glowing iron found hands, faces, feet, places that would scar forever, if any of them had been destined to leave this kitchen alive. But they weren't. As the shadows lengthened, she prepared for the last act. 18 hours the furnace had burned at its peak. Now she dragged each half-conscious body closer, until the heat was so intense it stole the breath from their lungs. "This is how you killed Thomas," she told Sutton as she positioned him just 3 feet from the coals. "You put him in a cage in the sun and let him cook. For 3 days. He begged for water, for shade, for death. You denied him, and you made the others watch. One by one, she placed them in their final seats, a perfect circle around the furnace, so each could see the others dying. So each could know exactly why. By nightfall, the screaming had faded into ragged, rasping breaths. The kitchen smelled of coal smoke, and something far worse. Esperanza sat in her corner, sharpening her knives, humming the Portuguese lullaby her mother had once sung in their village before the raiders came. She didn't need to watch. She could hear their suffering in every struggling breath. Midnight came, and one by one, the sounds stopped. Edmund Greyfield was the last to hold on, his wealth and fine living giving him just enough strength to bargain in a dry, broken whisper. "Please, I can give you money, freedom, whatever you want." Esperanza looked at him as he had once looked at her, a thing to be appraised. "I want you to die knowing you were wrong," she said. "You are not superior, not chosen by God, not a master. You are just a man who chose to be evil, and now you pay the price." Those were the last words Edmund Greyfield ever heard. Dawn broke over Greyfield Estate on June 25, 1716. The slaves who came to start the day stopped cold at what they saw in the kitchen. 14 blackened bodies in a perfect ring around the furnace, charred beyond recognition, but still wearing the fine clothes of power. And in the center, at the table, sat Espiranza de Lima, humming, sharpening her knives. When the white overseers arrived, the shock was absolute. 14 of the colonies, most feared and powerful men, destroyed by a single woman they had owned. It was unthinkable and terrifying. If one slave could do this, what if others learned? Within days, the story hushed, distorted, but unstoppable, spread across South Carolina. The authorities faced a choice: avenge the massacre publicly, or bury it deep to avoid inspiring rebellion. Either way, the Greyfield massacre had already done what Esperanza intended. For the first time, the masters of South Carolina knew fear. The entire plantation system relied on one unshakable belief, that resistance was hopeless, and white dominance eternal. The Greyfield massacre threatened to shatter that illusion forever. If word spread that a single woman, armed with nothing but intelligence, patience, and resolve, had eliminated 14 of the most powerful men in South Carolina, the colony's economy and order could collapse overnight. Governor Robert Johnson convened an emergency council in Charleston. For 3 days, the colony's elite debated the crisis. The verdict was cold and calculated: bury the truth. The official records of the Greyfield massacre were sealed under gubernatorial order and locked away for 50 years. The victims' families were told their kin had died in a tragic kitchen fire during a business meeting. Not a single word was spoken of Espiranza de Lima, but her fate was another problem entirely. A public execution risked spreading her legend. Letting her live risked inspiring more rebellion. The solution was cruel, precise, and politically expedient. Sell her to a Spanish trader bound for the silver mines of South America. A delayed death sentence. In those mines, slaves rarely survived beyond 2 years. Still, there was a risk. If Esperanza survived the voyage and reached Spanish territory, she might escape and spread her story. So they arranged that she would never arrive alive. On July 15, 1716, 3 weeks after the massacre, was loaded aboard the Spanish vessel Santa Isabella, bound for The captain carried secret orders, make her death look accidental. The ship's log claimed she died of fever on the 3rd day and was buried at sea, but rumors persisted. Survivors whispered that she'd prepared contingencies, spoken with free black sailors in Charleston, and trained other slaves in her final weeks, teaching them herbs, anatomy, the weaknesses of their masters, and the vulnerabilities of the entire plantation system. Justice burns slower than coal, she told them, but burns complete. The fire I started will spread. Whether or not she survived, the damage was done. Over the next months, unrest rippled through South Carolina's slave quarters. There were no more mass killings like Greyfield, but fires broke out in plantation kitchens. Overseers suffered accidents at moments of isolation. Livestock sickened without clear cause. Tools vanished from storage, reappearing days later where they could do the most harm. Most alarming, slaves began demonstrating uncanny knowledge of their owners' private schedules, family affairs, and business dealings. It was as if an invisible intelligence network had formed across the colony, linking plantations that had once been isolated. The fear among the white population was immediate. Masters who once strolled their land with arrogant ease now traveled with armed escorts and avoided predictable routines. The Rice Council's monthly gatherings, the cornerstone of their power, were suspended indefinitely. Some owners softened their treatment, hoping fear could be bought off with slightly better food or fewer beatings. Others doubled down, imposing harsher punishments and stricter control. These plantations saw even more accidents, slowdowns, and escapes. Colonial law responded with fresh chains banning gatherings of more than 3 slaves, restricting movement, imposing brutal penalties for even holding a tool that could be a weapon. But the more they tried to choke resistance, the deeper it burrowed underground. Meanwhile, Esperanza's story began to move beyond the rice fields, whispered in free black communities, carried by sailors, repeated by early abolitionists. Her name became a symbol. Whether she'd died at sea or reached Spanish Florida didn't matter anymore. She had become a weapon, proof that even the most powerful masters could bleed. Decades later, in 1739, the Stono Rebellion erupted, the largest slave uprising in colonial America. Some leaders had ties to plantations linked to the old Rice Council. No one could prove the connection, but the shadow of Greyfield was there. The massacre had shown that careful planning could bring down giants. That lesson had not been forgotten. By the time the American Revolution arrived, the plantation system already bore the cracks of fear. Masters no longer believed in their untouchable power. Slaves no longer believed in their permanent chains. When Charleston's sealed records finally opened in 1766, the colonies were already rumbling toward independence. The Greyfield massacre was overshadowed by bigger headlines, but its ghost had done its work. Some say Esperanza did survive. A Spanish ship's clerk wrote in his private journal about a Portuguese-speaking woman secretly transferred from the Santa Isabella in Havana. She spoke with precision about South Carolina plantations, their owners, their weaknesses. She called Greyfield the first lesson, and said there would be others. The fire that began in one kitchen, she told him, will spread too many kitchens. Soon after, Spanish Florida recorded an influx of unusually escaped slaves. They carried maps of patrol routes, names of sympathetic contacts, and instructions for exploiting a master's habits and fears. Plantation owners in South Carolina began reporting incidents coordinated to be coincidence: fires, poisonings, fatal accidents, all threaded together by a hidden hand. Fear had taken root in the master's heart, and once planted, it would never leave. The kitchen at Greyfield stood empty for 66 years. No slave would work there. Eventually, the building was demolished, the land left to wild growth. But the story lived on, passed down in whispers. Those who treat human beings as property do so at their own peril. Property can think, property can plan, property can remember, and when pushed beyond endurance, property fights back. Justice burns slower than coal, but it burns complete.